that's all right. But what I'm hoping to do is kind of bridge these some esoteric concepts, bring in some art, some ancient teachings, and then really simplify them in a way that make them very practical and useful, and kind of take them out of the realm of the occult. Because there was a great talk, but I remember a friend of ours giving a lecture a while back and talking about, and Master Samael probably says this too, but that to veil in mystery some of the esoteric expressions, they started using the word clairvoyant instead of imagination. Because imagination sounds childlike, but it's absolutely imagination. And so in the same way, a lot of things get draped, and what happens is then intellectualism, and then the intellect covers these things a little further, and we get these concepts and ideas so removed from just real practical application. And so in some sense, I may be making light in a lot of the way that I go about this, but for me, that's what's natural and makes it accessible and happy and joyful, because it should be. It does, as I like to say, that one does not need to be serious to be serious. I mean, the world has enough seriousness of its own. To make mock is not the objective, but to maintain lightness and joy and see the humor in situations, and it doesn't mean that we can't still be responsible and carry out a great work, which is, what we're doing. One of our greatest mentors and teachers, very, very natural, and does things and did things that you would think, oh wait, that's not Gnostic. But we wouldn't say he's not serious, because he's much more serious than we are. But he was very light and fun, and just held things lightly, and understanding that, again, there's enough drama in the world, which is the resistance to our work. And as Master Samael tells us, the trouble is that we, in our minds, multiply that resistance. And so that's another component of the three factor, or the three elements, the three forces that we looked at in relation to continuity and accomplishing things. We're going to go with those similar topics and look also into another aspects of the three forces and how they are shown and applied in art and teachings. I was trying to get you guys off my screen, and it didn't actually work. There it is, the grabby point. Sorry. I know you did everything you could, Judith, to make this professional, and I'm just still dumbing it down. It's the idiot's guide. So, yeah, the fool's guide. So, and so we looked at that and the expression in relation to these three forces. And in Gnosis, if we want to get more serious, we'd say the three forces are the law of three, which is the law of creation, which is really at the essence of all the processes of awakening. Not just at all the processes, at all the levels it can be applied. But why, for a fool, or a simple way to undertake it, is that the element, the formula for awakening is similar. It's almost identical. It does not become more complicated than the simple basics of self-observation, self-remembering, meditation, and having the correct state. Now, I suppose in Canada that would be the correct province, but to have the correct province of consciousness, and how to apply that and how to understand that in its very basic sense, it does not change too much as we go on. And the essence is to not identify. As Master Samael tells us, the key component is not identify. in the very small and in the very big. If we can learn that and learn it very deeply in our consciousness, then whether it's something extreme or something simple, we're going to be able to utilize, as I said last week from the words of David, the psalmist, Lord, grant that my enemies become your footstool, or my footstool, thy footstool. And what that means is how to take advantage of the second force, the obstacles, and use them as a mechanism for awakening. Because the mechanism for sleep, is the same mechanism for awakening. It allows us to awaken by showing us how we're asleep. We could not awaken if we could not see the means by which we are asleep. So at the fundamental relationship of this, the law of three, the law that creates, which is also the law that destroys, which is very fundamental to the first main factors of awakening, which is to be born, to die, and the third is to sacrifice, to understand how to work with those. And the relationship of sacrifice is working in combination with birth and death. Because in order to be born, we have to sacrifice something. And in order to die, we have to sacrifice something. So at the root is the holy Triomakazi Kamno, or Triakazi Kamno. It's pronounced differently depending on the publication that you get it in. But it's the law of three, and that it's sacred and it's shown. And as I showed you last week in relation to this image or images, you see these great trinities. We looked at the one with the Pharaoh Ramses, Horus, and Set, which is, as Master Samael would say, it's irrefutable. But that's what that represents. But how can we apply that and make that make sense? We see it ingrained in the relationship to these structures as well. Here you see behind, which is probably, if you were to say Egypt, you would have to think of a pyramid, right? I mean, that's just the first and foremost thing you think. And now we know from the teachings of Master Samael, and we talked about this a little bit in the last course, that these are temples, and they're not temples as the intellectual mind or the science tells us now that they are, or these great tombs. Because think about this for a moment. This would be probably the world or humanity's greatest blunder, greatest epic fail. I said I don't use the word failure, but this would be it. That from their point of view, and I'm not going to go into it completely, but from their point of view is over 25 years and thousands of slaves moving bricks, blocks, hundreds of miles with rolling logs, pushing them up hills, and we've already shown that actually is not possible to do, but that was how it was believed thousands of years ago. The Greeks said that, and it's kind of, we built on that. And now the problem of technology is, with technology we understand how much we didn't know, but yet we haven't changed our paradigm to that. We still figure that's how it was made. We're not going to get into that, but let's just assume that they did, right? To build this great tomb and all the anomalies in the pyramids, it's amazing, a wonderful study. All of the anomalies and impossibilities. I show in some classes, I've shown this, the crane of today that we would have to use to set these blocks with the precision that they did, which they didn't have apparently. But the great blunder is they built this great, massive, can be seen from space pyramid as a tomb for a pharaoh that he never once laid in. There's no human DNA of death in the tomb. So that's quite a big undertaking. For you say, I work in construction. We go through this, and in the end, they're like, you know what? We're not going to live here. And then they couldn't sell it. I mean, it's kind of a niche market. But anyway, but for the esotericists, it's completely understood what this is, even without the teachings of Master Samael. It is an initiatic construction. because the tomb represents dying to the world, or represents the death that the being has already undertook because at the expense of the sacrifice that we've made to live, the being has sacrificed himself and waits for us to awaken. I was watching some stupid movie, which I've done before, so that's not the interesting part. But I had this comprehension, which is what happens when I watch stupid movies for some reason. But that we spend so much time as an essence, as a consciousness, thinking about what can I do to awaken? Praying to the being, how can you help me to awaken? That our whole focus is on our process of awakening instead of thinking and praying, what can I do for you? Have we ever thought that? Have we ever got on our knees and prayed for our being? We pray for experiences, we pray for comprehension, we pray for good fortune, we pray for all of these things. But in reality, our whole purpose is and should be oriented towards our being. And the teachings tell us that the being has died. The being is dead. We see this in many different traditions. And so that was a brief offshoot onto the pyramid, but let's look at the pyramid as a symbol in relation to what we've been talking about. Now, if you lift the pyramid up, you see that it has actually 4 faces. We think of the pyramid as a triangle, and it is, because it has 3 sides to it. But it's 4 faces, and in essence, what the pyramid represents is the human being in our totality. It represents the human being as the tree of life, but it also represents the state or province in which we find ourselves in relation to the being, our level of being first and foremost, and this is what we're going to look at a little bit tonight to continue with the relationships with the law of 3. So if you see these symbols right here, and you take the triangle as a 3 and the square base as the bottom, right away you see this symbol right here, and it represents the relationship of the physical world, or Malkuth. And esoterically, the Fool's Guide would tell you that the square is the symbol fundamentally for matter. It represents Malkuth, or the kingdom, or the 4 kingdoms, which are mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdoms. It also has the 4 elements. There's also 4 states of matter. So in essence, when we think of the 4, we think of matter. And as I said last week, and we'll continue to bounce back and forth, the relationship of the 3 and the 4, that the 3 equals 4 and the 4 equals 10. And I showed that because if we do our math, 1 plus 2 plus, I didn't do this before, plus 3 plus 4 is 10. And that represents the kingdom as we find it. But 10 represents the totality of the tree of life, because it relates and combines the 7 planets of alchemy and the spiritual sun, which is composed of the Trinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So we have the law of 3 at the top in its firstmost point, and these 7 sephira below, which is the 3 and the 7. And in the 7, we have the 4 and the 3. Now, how this applies to us now, first, we look at this first triangle, which, as you see here, is inverted, which is our mind, the individual's mind, heart, and action. Or we could say the intellect, the emotion, and the energy. And in this action is placed right here at the middle, in the center column of the tree, but in the middle of these 3 spheres, because this represents the energy with which we move, the energy with which we do everything. And as it is, as we talk about, the fundamental fall or the degeneration of mankind is due to fornication. And the first act of fornication is in relation to these three brains. Excessive thinking is fornication in the mind. When, as Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no, everything else comes from the evil one. The evil one, the depths of our own psychology. We feel that we need to go back and forth, up and down, in and out to try to make a decision. But that's because we're relying solely on the intellect, or allowing the weight of all the processes of the mind to weigh on us. When in actuality, the mind's objective purpose in relation esoterically is to show us. It is the consciousness and the process to comprehend what's being shown. The problem is our mind, in a state of fornication or overacting and overmoving, like playing a shell game, never allows the opportunity for the consciousness to contact the objects, so that comprehension is not possible. The same with the emotional state and the emotions of the heart. We need peace. We need calm to allow the reflection process to take place, which is why we need meditation. I'm going to move from the activity of self-observation and the three forces that we looked at last week, and apply this to the meditation practice and try to make it very simple. I hope it's going to be so.
Fool's way.
The fool's way. Yeah, I know. That should be the, I don't know if that's marketable. Let's see. But let's go a little deeper. So if we take this symbol again and we see the relationship of the tree of life, now I'll show how it really relates to the tree of life. So you have the 4, which is the base. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. As I was communicating the relationship of the mind and overuse of the mind, over-emoting, what happens is when we spend all of the energy of the mind, because each of these realms, there's physical, mechanical energy, right? There's emotional energy, or the energy of motion, which is where the term comes from, which is why when we're moved to do something, it's moved from the heart to do something. I jumped over this one, but sexual energy, which is what we will come back to, or the energy of Yesod, or the foundation of all creation. So when we're speaking about the law of 3 in creation, we have to understand that it has a direct relationship to this sphere here. Mental energy, there's energy of the willpower, which we looked at last week, in trying to change the will to willingness. And that makes a fundamental shift in the way, not in the words, obviously, it should be in the way that we carry out the practice, or a practice, holding it lightly, having the willingness, the joy to participate, to be a participant, to be a participant in the being's understanding. That is really what we're trying to do. And at the highest level, the Christ submits his will to the Father's will, facing the most difficult phase of the path, because that was an esoteric circumstance that Jesus the Christ went through. But it's something that all masters to complete the path have to go through. And you can find it in different ways and in different times in all of the teachings. And we use the word Christ, but that's the most common term. But in the course that we gave last, it would be, instead of the name Christ, they would use Quetzalcoatl. In the Egyptian mysteries, it was Osiris, or Osiris-Ra. To be Christified would be to be Assyrified, or Assyrified, yeah. So what happens is, when we abuse the energy of the mind or the will, or up here we have in the superior realms the energy of the consciousness, and here we have the energies of the spirit. But we're down here in the world of the mind and the heart, and our actions. And so when we over engage ourselves, and I had this experience once physically, right? Where I was really busy at work, not thinking properly, and I slammed my van door on my thumb. And it was one of those moments where everything slowed down, but I couldn't do anything about it. I'm watching my thumb going, wow, I just closed the door. Bam! Yep, that's what happened. But in my job at that time, I was really under a lot of pressure. We were shutting down all of the lights to a skyscraper. It was just me, oddly enough, and I had to move it all to a controller and do these weird things. And so it had been planned for weeks. So I'm working with my thumb throbbing. I don't know if you've ever experienced that throbbing where you feel, hey, that's my heartbeat right there, like bam. But as the day went on, I realized the expression of physical pain actually uses energy because it actually tired me out from that intense sensation. So intensity of sensation, intensity of emotion, intensity of thought or overthinking is a fornication, and that in order to stay alive and keep going, that energy then is taken from the great reserve of the sexual center. So fornication in the mind leads to fornication in the sexual center. And we say, as we said before, at its basic, at its fool's interpretation, fornication means to use more energy than is required to fulfill a task. So when I overthink a situation, I'm fornicating in my mind. When I worry excessively, I'm fornicating in my heart. And this is something to observe and feel and see, but these are things that separate us consciously and that keep us tied to the world, to the physical world through the mind and the heart and the energy and action. So to move beyond this, we have to understand what the great work means is to transform and really erect or construct, like the Masons have in their studies, to construct the temple for the being to be worshipped or resurrected. And so now we look at this, what is one of the symbols of what's called the cubic stone or the philosopher's stone, which is the square, which now in the superior sense represents a work that's accomplished when we stop the identification with the mind, the heart, and the energy to the point that we stop the fornicating and begin to assimilate and transmute that energy. Imagine we have enough energy for a day that could think 1,000,000 thoughts. And let's imagine, well, that's a high number. Let's say 100,000 thoughts, and we think 1,000,000 thoughts. Well, that's a negative, right? But imagine if we have enough energy to think 100,000 thoughts, and we only thought 100. So all of that excess energy could be applied towards awakening the internal mind. And in the end, with the work, the third element, which we looked at self-observation last week and congruency in our process of the day, we're going to look at meditation today. And when you couple that with the third element of transmutation, which is to take advantage of energy that we have accessible to us, now you're actually working on the path of initiation and recreating yourself, renewing yourself, so that then in time, and in the first chamber, we're going to go through this in great detail, in time, we create a new physical vehicle, a new body of etheric vehicle of energy, a new emotional vehicle, and a new mental vehicle. So then these four lower bodies are represented by this square. And then this next body of will, consciousness, and spirit is then ascended to form this triangle here. And now, even more so, and if you've studied your Egyptian constructivity, that the process was at the top of every temple. Now, to a degree, these elements have been taken, but they would gold plate the tip, because that's the element that symbolized the sun or the solar force, to channel and to draw the energy into the temple and to also transmit it outward, because the gold relates to the sun, but it also relates to the Christ. So you see, here you have the complete tree of life with this triangle here as the Christic pinnacle on the pyramid. To go even further, in direct relationship to the process of initiation, this same pattern is used for what in Egypt is called the benbin, or the obelisk. It's the same pattern on the base with a triangle on the top, 4 sides, but differently. And we know we can verify the importance of these esoteric emblems because, one, they're filled with these what are called cartouches, which is sort of like a word bubble of hieroglyphics that tells a story. But it's actually what it's telling is the process of initiation. And how we know that these were so important, they're always placed at the front of the temple. And even more so that when the Romans, this is a term, sacked Egypt, right? Mm-hmm. When the Romans sacked Egypt, as much as the construction of the pyramid was difficult, right? They, along with taking all the things of value, they took all the obelisks that they could find and they placed them right in front, not so you couldn't enter, but right in front, architecturally, in front of the door of the cathedrals, of the churches. Now, they only had so many, of course, but sometimes they fabricate them, and you'll see this symbol still, and then it's replicated in the steeple and the doorway, which is the mysteries of creation. Those two symbols, the masculine and the feminine. But you'll see it, and you'll see generally a fountain, which represents Yesod, the elements of water, a fountain, and an obelisk in front of the main cathedrals, churches. Why would Marcus Aurelius, or as I like to say, Aurelius Marcus, I know I'm getting too silly, right? I'm a little crazy, but this is the last public night, so let's have a little fun. Aurelius Marcus brought from Egypt. I mean, that's a big task. I don't even know how you would do that, because these things are 2 or 3 stories tall, some of them. Anyway, so they had very special spiritual importance. And even so, right, even from the early Christian tradition that tried to separate themselves from the pagans, yet these pagan stones are at the doors. It shows that there is an undercurrent thread that runs through all the esoteric teachings. And then in those cathedrals, in some of those cathedrals, in the alcoves of those cathedrals, were still carried out ancient rituals. I could go on, but I think we get the point. But let's look at this to verify this, right? Here's a statue of a pharaoh, and this is a beautiful statue because the pharaoh in this statue is naked. And that implies, it's not a sexual thing, but it implies that individual with all his authority and power kneeling with, again, the tomb of Osiris in the coffin on his lap. That the work is to submit oneself to work to resuscitate the being, which is what Osiris represents. And on his back, and you can see this, I could have drawn from 100 or probably 1,000 different Egyptian statues where they have the initiation symbol on the back, because as Master Samael tells us, that the initiations are written on our spine. But they ascend, or they're carried out by the merits of the heart. So we can't just intellectually go through a process of initiation. We cannot just do it because we desire it. We have to, as we said last week, be able to demonstrate the values that were being incorporated. Now this, in other lesser grand cultures, was still being carried out. For instance, in the Polynesian and in some of the Mesoamerican First Nations, the tattoos were used for that. And actually in Moana, which we highly esoteric film, we recommend you watching with your heart and understanding that it's the mysteries of the path there. In the very beginning, Moana's friend is receiving a tattoo because he passed into some form of manhood. They didn't talk about it, but on the base of his spine. There's so many symbols in that thing. And it's a fish. We'll have to watch it. Yeah, we'll watch it again. That'll be a movie night. We love that. It is deeply esoteric, oddly enough. So the initiatic path is written on our spine because it's written with the energy that courses through our spine, which is directly related with the cerebral spinal nervous system, because it connects the emotional center with the nervous ganglion right here. It's like a sun right here with what's called the solar plexus. Connects it with all the endocrine system. And so the three major nervous systems relate us to what we call in Gnosis the three brains, or the brain of the mind, the brain of the heart, and the brain of action, or the motor instinctive sexual brain. And those three things are the first things that in our studies in First Chamber that we're going to look at, is how to begin to know ourselves, because each of us has all three of those brains, all five of those centers, all seven potential faculties of the consciousness there, but we tend to predominate one center over the other, one brain over the other. And so that is the first level of trying to psychologically understand ourselves, self-knowledge. But because we have these three, which connects us again to the law of three, traditionally there has been three paths, or three ways for humanity to come to awaken. Now, first, let's go back another three. We could go 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. But the process of awakening requires, as we said, three factors: birth, death, and sacrifice. Those we'll cover in the future classes. But fundamentally, what's required before understanding that is the three jewels, which is a guru, or in the East what's called the Buddha. You need a Buddha. The Dharma, or the teaching, and the Sangha, or the community. So these were three communities that were traditionally used. But to understand and make it simple, the guru, in essence, in its deep sense, is your being, which needs to be resurrected. But in order to resurrect and to have the being fulfill his mission, or her mission, androgynous, there needs to be a teaching. So first there's a teacher as the guru, a teacher that must have a teaching, not just any teaching. It has to be a teaching that outlines the path of initiation to connect and resurrect the being. The third thing that's needed is a school or a community. Now, in some extreme cases, people have done this all by themselves, but this is very, very rare. And even in those, they usually connect. Even in the case of Master Samael, he began in different schools before the Gnostic teachings, where he was a Rosicrucian prior to that, and studied with the Rosicrucians and the Theosophists, until the connection with his being was made and the great arcanum was given to him. And so for us, the Dharma, or the teaching, is fundamental, because it's not just any teaching. We're in a world of teachings, classes, courses, workshops. We need the teaching to connect us to the path. And we need a community or a school to provide an environment, because it's very difficult to awaken independently, to work in a support group. And many people come and go in schools and paths and find stagnation to some degree, because we don't have the energetic exchange among people, sharing experiences, sharing ideas, sharing hopes, sharing loves, and working to support one another. So in that, there was 3 traditional means. And this relates fundamentally to the different aspects of the human experience. First, here we would say, is the path of the yogi, which is the path of intellectual pursuit and rational understanding, but working with the mind fundamentally. Because there's what is called Jnana Yoga, which is the yoga of rational, I'm forgetting the word, rational confrontation, and using the mind to break through concepts. But this, again, needs a guru, a teacher, and a teaching. And fundamentally what was required, and is required to enter into this path, is a renunciation of all of life, and to go and join in the monastery and carry that out. I went on a long meditation retreat. I've been on many different retreats, but this particular one was a Buddhist retreat, and it was a 10-day retreat, and just because I wanted to experience that and have some understanding of that. And it was a fascinating retreat, and there was great depth in the practice, which was very simple. And I asked the teacher about something, and his response was, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that, because you're never going to experience any of those things outside of the retreat setting." And I was just like, wow, that seems a little harsh, you know. But there's truth, because depth can only be, you know, the mind can really only be broken down in a consistent way with just pressure with consciousness over periods of time until certain stages are reached. But much can be accomplished, but in that school and in that lineage, that's the way that it's carried out. And that's more of a modern version, but in that version, what they offer is retreats upon retreats. And after the several 10-day retreats, and you can do a 30-day retreat or a 3-month retreat. And that's how the whole focus is. And there's other schools like that. But in this teaching, you would have to find a true teaching and give up everything. And we see this in facets of Buddhism. To be a real Buddhist, you give up everything, your clothes, everything, and you leave society. Likewise, the way of the monk, which is the way of the heart, which is the way of devotion. And it's focusing all of one's energies towards perfect and superior emotional relationship. And this is a very wonderful and beautiful path, but likewise, it is required to leave the world, because there's too much negative influence and force in the world to really have a calm heart. So the third is called the way of the Fakir, which is creating will over the physical body. And in India, there's still many Fakirs. It's not really a path that we see here in the States, where we can probably kind of relate to a monk and a yogi in different monasteries that are even around here. But I don't know if there's any Fakirism here, but they don't usually have monasteries. They're usually just a guy that has decided that it's through imitation of his master, refuses a certain aspect of itself, like will raise his hand forever until it can no longer be lowered, and it calcifies and it atrophies, and his disciples will carry him to bathe and all of these other elements. It's a little more obscure, but in the East, if you go into India, you will still see the fakirs on the side of the road and with their attendants. And its objective is to create dominion over the physical body. And it creates willpower to some degree, just like willpower over the emotions or willpower over the mind. But as Master Samael says really clearly, it does not create the body of conscious will. So in the end, you still have to work on your emotions and your mind. And obviously you're doing a little bit of that on each of them, but they're centered in this way. Now we know, and this school that we're a part of is considered a fourth way school, meaning it is a path that incorporates all three paths. And if I was selling it, I would say, with the beauty is that you do not need to leave society. That was day one. Like you want to join, okay, you got to get rid of everything and go to the monastery. Before you're even 100%, this is what I want to do. But usually people would be moved and really want that. But the fourth way is the way of the sly man. It's not renouncing our life, but renouncing our attachments to life. It's best enclosed in the words of Jesus to be in the world, but not of the world. And in this way, we dominate the world because we're in contact with the world. It's the way of the sly man, Gurdjieff said, because it's the way that's actually the most efficient way to work. And at the heart of this, Master Samael tells us that the true fourth way practitioner that incorporates all of the aspects, such as mental concentration and calming and quieting the mind, connecting with the superior emotion and dominating our desires, and working physically in the world that we're in, but with the essence of the energy of our sexual center and transmutation, that one has the ability of completing the path in totality in one lifetime. And it's very difficult, just like for the Greeks to comprehend what it took for the Egyptians to make it. It's very difficult for us now to even have a sense of what a grand or great work that actually is. So the first chamber program that we will be teaching is going to go step by step to realize, wow, how great an undertaking that is. And to not only awaken totally in all these spheres, but in the superior dimensions, and to fuse ourselves with the being, to resurrect the being in the end, and to liberate all of those elements inside of ourselves, most of which we don't even really know that we have, which is why it's so important to have the interactions in life, because those are the interactions that bring them out. It's okay to, say, have a cup of coffee, which this doesn't count, but have a cup of coffee that you really want to have and set it there and not identify with it and not have it. Now that's going to produce some level of will and comprehension. It's not what I'm working on right now.
Then what if I come take your cup of coffee now?
And I don't get it back. That would be bad. But my point being is that's simple, right? I can deal with simple things like that. But in the work, as we start to work in those simple things, we are going to start to see things in the depths of our consciousness. In the depths of our consciousness. and work to not identify with them, and in that overcome them, overcome through comprehension. And we're going to look at the process of comprehension in a real simple way to affect that. Are you going to hold that all night? No. See, it was a lose-lose at that point. So those are the three main paths and the fourth path, or the fourth way. In essence, that's the core of that teaching, but understanding that we have three brains and three ways of feeling, and that there are always spiritual teachings to help the ones that were more intellectually based, the more emotionally based, or the more body-based. But we see these in degenerated forms in the world that we're living in now. For instance, Fakirism, or people that dominate themselves and work primarily with the physical body instinctive center, going to the gym 2, 3, 4 hours a day, excessively running extreme things, running marathons upon marathons upon marathons, and not to take away from any of those accomplishments or the beauties, but to understand for ourselves what's success. And to understand ourselves is primary, is the key, to have that ability to live above this world that we're speaking of. So now we're going to go from the cartouche to the cartoon. To find ourselves situated in the superior triangle, in the consciousness, working within the world. And the objective now, and this is interesting because if we, sometimes we feel on top of the world, and the world is always spinning. The problem with being on top of the world, being ahead of our game, ahead of our work, like we looked at last week, right? That those cycles that unfold, that we say, I will do this, or I will be better, and then we don't. And then the don't becomes, I can't. And then we justify and say, I can, but I don't. And we have these oppositions inside of our psyche. And that cycle happens that when we're on top of the world, we have to understand the world keeps spinning. And if we don't keep moving or keep working or know how to work in the precise way, a world that's spinning, if we're on top of the world, eventually the world's going to be on top of us. And that is a cycle that just continues to happen. And I know if we reflect, we see that in our work always. And the key is this, it's identification. When we identify with anything, with a thought or a feeling, it brings us down and under. So for instance, look at our little guy here who's running around the planet. If he stops to pick something up, he's thrown down to the abyss, down below. And that's what identification does. And the world is on top of us. And now imagine, have you ever, I can't say everybody, so we can't do show of hands, been to a carnival and been on one of those really intense rides like the Hammer? Have you ever, the Hammer, where it has these big hammer arms and it does this? And what you feel when you're at the bottom, you feel the G-force, you feel the weight, like, and like you can't even move up, right? This is the state of our consciousness now. We are in that inferior state, feeling all of the weight and the pressure on top of us. But we've been here for so long, it's become normal. And we've learned to live and make sense of that state of pressure upon us. So the symbol that was used for this was Atlas in the ancient times. But that represents us, that we are under the pressure, under the weight of the world. And how does this happen? With all the fornication in the mind and the way the mental processes take place, right? That energy doesn't go away, it just keeps forming in our mind. And when we make a decision or a choice, when we have to make that choice, we feel the weight of all of the other possible choices, or the weight of what it is that I'm taking. So that simple action, which should be very simple to make a choice, it has all this weight. And the times that we're living in, people say, you have to take a choice, you have to take a stand. It has so much pressure on it. Now the world magnifies that pressure. And we have so much pressure on us to think a certain way or to be a certain way, which makes awakening much more difficult. Because then we've crystallized concepts in our mind and the way that we think about ourselves and the way that we behave. So now, as we looked at last week, those three forces in action, and we did it as a practice, and we're not gonna, and one of the things we're gonna do in our first chamber group is have much more opportunity to share and also accountability and responsibility to do the practices. And that's where the support helps, that we all as a community work together to do the practices so that we have something to bring back to the community and share our insights and reflections, whatever they may be. But we carried out in the relationship of one task and trying to identify resistance and maybe see what resistance looks like even outside of what we normally think of as resistance. Now, what I didn't say, but is fundamentally important to understand in relation to the mind and to the heart, and I'm using the word heart, I usually say emotion, but heart just sounds more friendly. And when we say heart, well, yeah, when we talk about the emotional center, there's two aspects. There's the inferior emotion center where desires process, and there's the superior emotion center where intuition and comprehension, love and compassion, those superior feelings are. And we're going to look at that in just a moment, because it's fundamental to process thinking and feeling through the superior centers to really have a perspective. Because as I showed in that image, we're either under the world or we're above the world. And that is just a relationship of the level of being in a given point. So step one in our path of self-observation is to notice when I'm feeling resistance, to notice when I'm feeling under something, under the influence of something, when I feel I have to say something or need to respond or react, so that we create enough space so that the consciousness has a space to illuminate. So when we make our choice, we are doing it from a place of will or action instead of reaction or conditioning. So in relation to this, we looked at it, the three forces, as a task. Now here, I showed this as dividing the attention as the attention or the objective or the subject that we put our attention on, our awareness, so it's attention with awareness in the location that we are in, dividing our attention in that way. I find this symbol very important, and I really like to use symbols and images, and I hope it's helpful as we look at this, even the cartoons. I find them very important to focus and to keep lightness to what we're doing and have an image or a symbol in our mind to occupy our mind so our mind doesn't become preoccupied. So this individual here, this guy is thinking, obviously. He's not speaking, but he's thinking about speaking. But understanding that not only do we have the law of three in relation to the accomplishment of a single task or the attempting to, but also every thought, feeling, and action also produces an impact or a resistance that then in turn produces a result. Every thought, feeling, and action is a first force. Now, as someone would say, pseudo-esotericism may say then the thing to do is to work with the mind and be positive. Affirmations and affirming I am good, I am light, I am love, I am peace. And just then continue to think positive thoughts. But that is not enough. That does not get things done, actually, because every thought, feeling, and action produces in time and space, meaning relative to their density, they will then produce a resistive force, and subsequently, thank you, a result will come of that. And that is what karma is. Karma is the third force in action. It's the first element. If we looked at the tree of life as we showed before, and in the Turon Kabbalah course, but the column, as you face the tree that's on the left, is the Sephira 3, 5, and 8. And that's the column of justice, or the column of karma in essence. And the first relationship of that is 3. The third arcanum, which is the third force, which means that third force, or the being, or our divine mother that fabricates our circumstances and our existence and elements and forms and images, has to balance the first and second force, which means when we are acting out of balance, that impact or the deficit we send to the Divine Mother. She has to struggle and suffer in relation to our fornication in our mind, the wrong way of thinking, the wrong way of feeling. She has to adjust all of that. So that's the first force of karma. The Divine Mother is the feminine aspect of our own being. We have an eternal father and we have an eternal mother. The father represents the active force of spirit, and the mother represents that of the matter or of creation, the creative form in action, which then utilizes the material matter of the mind, or mental matter, emotional matter or desire, and matter and the instincts, which then affects the endocrine system and all of our physical body. But all of our emotional sufferings and our intellectual abuses also affect the Divine Mother. She loves us continually and always and would never leave us. She loves us so much and can continue to bear, which is the symbol that she represents as Mary, the mother of Christ, that bears, as Jesus bared the sins of the world. The Divine Mother, as Mary, bears her son bearing the sins of the world. And it's so important that you will see in every painting, generally of the crucifixion, Mary is there. And she, out of love, does not look away. She's with her son all of the way. She is with us all of the way. The difficulty is that we don't see her. Because if we did, we would see the suffering that we cause her. I had an experience a long time ago where I was put in place of this little picnic table with this gentleman and this woman, and we were sitting at the picnic table, and the gentleman said something, and I, in my manner, made a sarcastic remark for a moment. It had to do with pie for some reason. And I thought it was innocent enough, but I was shot out of the seat and blasted through space, and then bam, I landed in a hallway, in a corridor of a school. And I was seated outside of the classroom. You ever had that happen as a kid? Probably none of you guys have ever had that happen, where you have to go sit outside the classroom. I mean, the symbol is clear. And I'm seated there. Before I even got to go, oh no, I looked over and there was a little girl standing right in front of me. And she had this giant wound, as if a bazooka went through her arm. I could see through her. And she just kind of pointed to it, and that was the end of the experience. If we had the ability to see the effects of our words, it's simple words and thoughts and feelings. It's not that we need to be over paranoid, but to understand that every thought, feeling, and action is producing an effect, a creation, that we are causing the Divine Mother to create circumstances, karmic circumstances with the law to carry these things out. So it's not a matter of thinking better thoughts. It's a matter of being conscious of our thoughts, because it would be impossible for us to understand the effects if we were not conscious. We can't just think good things. We have to be conscious of what we're thinking. That is the only way we have the hope of understanding when this circumstances arises in my life. I mean, it's beautiful to say everything happens for a reason. And so this is just an opportunity, and this is true, but thinking it, saying it, we have to feel it. It has to impact us. Because everything happens for a reason, yes, but we don't know what that reason is because we don't know what we were thinking when it was created. We don't know whether it came from below or above. As I've demonstrated for the future courses with the law of the octave, how that operates, that when a note vibrates, the octave, many below and many above vibrate also. So just because something vibrates or moves in the physical world, we don't know if its origin was in the superior dimensions or in the inferior dimensions. And yes, everything happens for a reason, and we have the ability of comprehending what that is, be it good or bad. There is no good or bad. It just shows us the relationship of our being to our being. But again, we're not going to know that unless we're conscious. So we can go through a lifetimes with all of these opportunities to learn, and if we're not conscious, we're not learning. If we have the great grace of actually getting some idea intellectually in our mind, when we leave this body, we don't get to keep it. The only things we get to keep are the values that crystallize in the consciousness. And that's why on that tree of life, the spirit and the consciousness are on a plane above everything else. We have to send that energy of those impressions through the consciousness. So those thoughts and feelings process through the realm of eternity. And this is another relationship of this serpent of eternity, that all thoughts, feelings, actions, and consequences express themselves in the fifth dimension. Now, we talked about this serpent and the meaning, and now we're looking at it in this point of view. This was stated earlier that, every, I think it was positive, negative thing, there's a positive with it. Yes, wherever there's a beginning, there is an ending. Wherever there is an obstacle, there's a solution. And that's what the symbol of the tail in the mouth represents. But the problem, again, is this. We have to utilize the consciousness to understand that every thought, feeling, and action that we're experiencing here exists as one finite point in the realm of an eternal expression of the being. If we do that, we won't be identified. But when we identify with that element, what happens is, if you can see it here, this is another little eternal serpent. And what happens is we identify and experience through the ego, through the mind, with negative emotions, this thought, feeling, or result in its own eternal nature, isolated from the eternity, the totality of all other elements. And we say things like always and never. Because in that thought or feeling, for the ego, that is true. That is all they have, is that thought or feeling. And when we say that or feel or overwhelmed with the pressure in a negative state, anger, outburst, identification, it's because that element is perceiving through us, and we are feeling this pain, this negative emotion, this thought in its eternal nature and saying that this is what I'm going to feel always. If we observe, that's what's going on in the mind in that moment, why we feel helpless. Now, the beauty is we all have this. But the beauty is just to remember, no matter how heavy or true this one thought or feeling is, we can disidentify with it, let go of it. If it's strong, it will continue to return, but what's going to happen is eventually it will go away. It will not go away all the way, but it'll go away enough for us to shift our perspective of the consciousness so that when it does come up, it comes up in another context. And then we have the ability to possibly see the solution. This is something we talk about in the first chamber course, and that we don't solve problems. Problems don't have solutions, they have dissolution. And that, again, brings us to the relationship of the law of three, which allows us to destroy elements. We dissolve problems. So now let's look at this process in another cartoon form. This guy is expressing this situation that takes place continually. Here, this is a sensation. It could be a sound, it could be a word, it could be an image, it could be a sensation of pleasure or pain, because every sensation, there's a dual nature to these centers, and that motor instinctive brain, that sensation is processed as pleasure or pain in the dual nature of expression. Notice that. You never, I don't know, it's just a weird thought. Like you're sitting, like say in meditation, you have a cramp. You never go, oh, that's blue. No, it's either pleasure or pain. Maybe you'll go, oh, that's a neutral sensation. But you know, usually it goes the meter's either going this way or that way. And then what happens is that energy, as soon as it comes in, touches the emotional center, and it becomes a representation. And we either like it or dislike it. From there, it goes from sensation to representation to contemplation. I'm going to put it in this because this is a mechanical process where we compare or contrast the like or dislike and create a thought. How can I get more or less of that? Which then we charge it with a feeling, the energy of motion, and then we act. But this is actually a reaction to a sensation, to a representation, to a mentation or a thinking process. Now, there are internal things where we may be thinking something and then we go through this process, charge it with a feeling, and then act. Rarely do we act without emotion. I mean, energy of motion, that's what the E stands for. That's why energy of motion, emotion. We created a word because motion is formed by what we're moved. We're moved to act. So what then happens over time, we create concepts inside of ourselves, ideas, identities about ourselves, beliefs that then we crystallize inside of us, that we then try to get more sensations that we like. And we're continually comparing and contrasting. And this cycle is the relationship of the mechanical relationship of the three brains that's happening continually. That we, again, these three forces can be met with consciousness at any given point to break through those elements. To at least have a space to understand, I just received a sensation. My body is going to tell me, you need to react. But if we can create that space, as I've said in past classes, that produces light. Space produces light. I don't have time to go into that right now, but We will show then what we do with this in a more practical sense, returning back to our practice, and this will set us up for the practice that we're going to do, something very simple. I said before, last week I said this, that there's trying, and trying is not doing. We try, and when we realize that we're trying, just like when I showed the thinking process, the thoughts, right, that is maybe a negative state, whenever we see it, that's the key to do it. It's not like, oh, what hope do I have? I'm trying to awaken. I'm trying to be good. I'm trying. As I showed that cycle, we can try forever. We have to do. And the keys that Master Soma gives us is so profound, is to not identify. When I have that in my mind, I'm trying. I can't. I can. Any of these affirmations or de-affirmations, it's a reminder to let go in that moment and not identify, not believe in that concept that says I can't or I can, and just do. Whatever that is. If I'm feeling identified with a state of sadness, then we affirm that continually. I'm sad, I'm mopey, I'm notice and let go and just be happy for a moment. The beautiful thing is to think, what would I be doing if I wasn't feeling this feeling right now? Very simple. But it takes space and consciousness to be aware of our identification. So then we can not revel in it or dwell in it, but so that we can notice it and let go of it, even if it's for an instant. That fraction produces a new first force that may not show its effect due to density immediately or soon, but if we're consistent, which is the important thing, consistent in our de-identification, the laws of the universe or the laws of the solar system will affirm or will mandate that we will be free of that thing. Imagine this, just imagine as a thought experiment. Imagine you have this, I don't want to belittle depression or that relationship, right? Because we all have that, and sometimes it's very extreme, and it's not easy to separate from these things. It's simple, but it's not easy. We understand that. We're all going through this. But imagine that element of depression. Imagine for yourself any element that you struggle with. Imagine that sense of self-worth or any element that you deem negative and wish you didn't have. Now imagine that element is present. And imagine if you had the ability to not listen or pay attention to it at all, ever. Just as a thought experiment. Whether it existed or not, it would have no bearing. Now, I know it's not easy, but it is simple. And it's just why we affirm this in the meditation practice, is just to return gently but firmly to the practice, no matter what's going on. So trying should help us to remember to do. So what happens is, and we apply this to our self-observation, first we have to remember, oh yeah, I need to be aware of myself. But often we remember, but we don't do. I understand that, right? Because I've experienced even being on the astral plane and being, oh, I need to remember myself so I can awaken my consciousness in the astral plane. Okay, and then I go on, thinking I did it. Sometimes we do, but that first force isn't enough to impact the consciousness. So this second element, which is feeling. So we remember, but we don't do. Let's say we remember and we do. If every time we remembered to be conscious, we did it, at least in that moment. Let's imagine we're battling sleep, right? Unconsciousness. And if every time we perceived unconsciousness, we remembered to be conscious, we would be awake. So we have to remember and then do. If even for a moment. We will explain later on how to increase that, but the first is do. What happens is we do, but we don't feel. So this is the element that we really impacts that first force is I'm doing it. I'm aware of myself, but now I need to feel it. Sink into my heart. Imagine that I'm radiating light, love, peace. I'm willing to be awake. I'm willing to do your will, my being. I am here, Lord. That's the prayer that I do when I remember. I am here. I am here. And then we just hold that. Because doing coupled with feeling in time will produce seeing. We will see things differently. We will see things internally, which then leads to knowing, then understanding. I'm not going to go into these last three right now, but these are the key components of Gnosis. Gnosis Now means the use of imagination, inspiration, and intuition, as Master Samuel says. Those are the obligatory steps to acquire knowledge. But we're going to apply this in meditation. So now I know we start to meditate, we sit down, boom. Automatically, we're thinking. I'm making light of all of us because we all do this. But I remember to do. The doing is doing nothing. The practice can be following the breath. It could be a mantra which incorporates the next phase, which we'll get to. But ideally, we're focusing in that central point, putting our attention on ourselves. Not thinking, and definitely not letting the thought become thinking, because thoughts are going to arise. But then we remember, and we do. And then we think. And then we do. This is the first phase. This happens to all of us. If 1,000 times I've taken away, 1,000 times I return gently, but firmly, but never wavering. The first level of the alchemical practice, or the first law of the alchemist, is to cook and cook and cook with never wavering. Never, there's another word.
Tiring.
Never tiring. Mm-hmm. We're tiring if we're trying. If we're doing, we're in the consciousness and we don't tire. So how we return back, if it's with frustration, then that is to remember to let go of that frustration. That's all you have to do. We all only have to do the thing that's right in front of us. And if frustration's in front of us, that's what we disidentify with. If pain, that's what we disidentify with. Then we may still choose to move, but we've changed the relationship. And then we think. And then we return. So this process keeps happening. This is the first phase. But once we've established ourselves in the breath like we did, and the thinking that's in the forefront eventually goes to the back. So that as we're seated and we're focusing, we might notice a thought, but it's not in front of us. It's like in the distance. But this is as important as focusing on the practice, whether it's the breath completely. But remembering attention with awareness in the space that we're in, feeling ourselves, being ourselves in the practice. Very important. that is going to help us to provide a container for the thinking mind to exist in our awareness. But for us, all we have to do is think about the practice. Focus all of our attention, which is the energy of the consciousness, our will or our willingness to be no matter what. So we're seated, we're practicing, and now comes the second part. Once we have this practice and we don't have a thought, we don't have to wait for the thinking to be back there. We don't have a thought. We move to phase 2, which is elevating our state or feeling. So now, I'm not thinking, I'm focused on whatever it is, relaxed, all these elements of the body first, let that go, because it's the mind and the body are related. And as we sit and take the attention to stay here, now we're attentive and aware. Now we feel. Now, this comes in several different ways. In the basic practice, when we're seated, we're quieting our mind, we're not thinking, and we notice and we come back, and we come back, and we come back. And once we're here, then sink into the heart, sink into the feeling, try to feel yourself. Feel hope, feel inspiration, but feel. Now, the other component, and we'll get into this as we go on, that you might have a negative state of anxiousness. What you might be feeling might be anxiousness, or it might be sadness or shame. Then feel that without identifying. You'll know that you're not identifying because you're not thinking about it. That energy of motion that wants to move is going to cause you to think. So we're holding all the cards here. So if we go back to the thinking and we notice we're thinking, okay, then we just let go and come back. If there's a negative state, we let that be. We feel it. Some of my greatest meditations have been in a really negative state. That's the focus. That's the beauty. It's like, what am I going to meditate on? How about this anxiousness that won't go away? Well, that'll be great because I want to concentrate. And I've got something to concentrate. The breath won't go away, but this negative state won't go away. But we have to continually hold it lightly and not let ourselves think, so we feel. Now, in the normal state, let's just go this way. We're doing the practice, and as we're doing the practice, we're quiet, we're focused, then we feel ourselves. And that's if we don't have a negative state there or some other state, but we feel. The key is to not identify with the thinking or identify with the feeling. The key is to be. Because then, if we hold that state and we have this state of hope or elation or elevated state and sit there, eventually we're going to see something. Eventually. And it comes from above or it comes from below. And the wonderful thing is, it emerges as an image, as a symbol that we may or may not know what it means. But the key to understanding, or these last three, is to see, to know, to understand, is that the image comes and we may not know what it means. But if we're fortunate, we know what it means. Like, oh, that's Atlas. To understand is to know how it applies. And this takes place in this exterior realm of our consciousness where the being acts through the consciousness as intuition, so that we understand what we're experiencing or comprehend. So this process is here. We do, feel, and see. Now, I will attest, this is true. Most of your practice will be in the doing and feeling. But that's fine. You're on the path. This is what's going on. So you're doing, seated, feeling, and the seeing then becomes looking. I'm looking into the darkness. I'm looking into the feeling. I'm looking into the space. I'm looking. I'm seeing. And then the process will unfold. If our feeling, our emotional state is correct, which is the state of inspiration, as Master Samuel tells us, when we see something, we will know what it means. That's what inspirational knowledge is knowing. But knowing isn't enough. We have to comprehend or understand how it applies to us. So many esotericists get lost in this seeing and fabricating some world that is a projection of their own mind, and they don't know how it applies to the world. Because as an initiate, you're not going to begin by be given the keys to how you are going to be the salvation. Now, with all respect, I don't know who's here or who isn't here, but I doubt that in your meditation practice you're going to be given the keys of how to save the Gnostic teaching for humanity or for the future or to do this great thing. Because what you're doing is, we have to understand what we're here in the teaching is to awaken the consciousness, first and foremost. It is not to do something. The mind will present it that way, as a resistive force to keep us from meditating, so that I will think about this thing, so then I'll plan about this thing, fantasize about this thing. And then that practice is done. And then the next practice, and the next day, and the next day. Trying to fulfill and write that great novel that God wants me to write. There's some truth to that. And trust me, I understand. I love creating. I love playing music. I'm sure God would love me to write the perfect song, but I'm not perfect yet. Exactly. Beautiful. But first and foremost, I need to awaken. I need to awaken. We come with proclevencies. Is that the word I used before that's not correct? No, tendencies, right? Creative, active, medical, all of these elements. We come with those things. They're part of our true vocation, but our true vocation, in essence, is the work of the being. All of it, the other is subsidiary. We don't want to be Atlas underneath the world. We want to be on top of the world. Because that is the great work. If we come to with these tendencies, it's because we've had these tendencies before. And we may have written great operas before or done great achievements. But the one thing that we know we haven't done is completed the great work. And that is, from the Gnostic teaching, what we're here to do. But you need to realize that for yourself by doing the simple practice and connecting to the being. So this is the practice we're going to do. We're just going to sit, feel, and mantras are great to help the feeling sense. And see. If we see nothing, that's what we see. So we do a little break, and we're back to, as I said, this class is all about practice. Not practicing, but talking about practicing, which is the first step. So let's take just a quick break, and we'll come back to the practice.
2 to 3 minutes break to stretch, take care of ourselves. You too. You too. animation going?
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
If you want, you can take your screen and drag it over and just focus on that whenever you get lost.
It's not as smooth in the play. Yeah. None of the animations are totally smooth. Yeah.
Well, that's good. If they look down, then it's because of the internet. In the doing, which is quieting the body, relaxing the body. In essence, this can all be reduced to one simple statement: to relax the body and remember the being. What we've given is simple steps to facilitate that. Now, last week we gave the practice of following the breath. And that's the most basic, important element to focus. But the idea is to focus our attention. So focusing at the tip of the nose and breathing, or using a mantra. But the key is not just to repeat it mechanically or observe mechanically. But once we have that taking place with the body relaxed, then we introduce the second phase of feeling. And we can always deepen the practice by deepening our feeling. Or, another depth of practice is noticing the feelings that get in the way or the thoughts that get in the way. But fundamentally, not identifying with them. If 1,000 times a thought takes us away, when we remember, then we do. We return to practice without feeling defeated. So the doing is focusing the attention, the relaxed body. You can pick a point like the tip of the nose where the breath comes and goes. And as soon as you feel yourself present with the breath, then move to feeling. Now this could be incorporated with prayer, with mantra, but it's really an attitude. It could be that of gratefulness, joy, but finding our internal motivation without thinking about it, but just feeling it. Pay close attention, as I like to say. Freedom isn't free. You have to pay attention. But pay close attention. If the mind says, okay, I'm feeling, now what? We let go and feel. Feeling does not have words, does not have concepts. I said, a simple prayer is, I am here, Lord, in relation to your being. I am here. Notice the feeling. Notice the feeling as you make this prayer. That is the important part. If the thinking is continual and in the forefront, let us utilize the counting of the breaths. Occupy the mind, give the mind something to do. The mind that's not content with doing nothing needs something to focus on. Labeling the exhale from 1 to 10. And when you reach 10, return to 1. And if at any point we forget what number we're on, gently but firmly we return to 1. With no shame, no frustration. But if it's there, we let go of it. And be grateful that this mechanism revealed that state that was under our awareness and now is present to us, that we can then let go. If we go beyond 10, when we notice, gently we return defined with 1. Nowhere to go. The mind wants us to go, take us other places. But the being, the consciousness is here. So there's nowhere else to go. And we allow all other elements to come to us. If it's important, it will come to us. Do the practice. Feel yourself. See. If darkness is what you see, then darkness is what there is. Do, feel, look, see. Notice impatience or boredom. And let go. We're going to bring the practice to the end, but let us incrementally, in 3 steps, return. More present and taking with you in gratitude what you experience. And let that 3rd bell be a reminder, the defining point, to do, to be as conscious and as awake as you can in this moment. And being this is our last public meeting, it'd be wonderful if anybody would like to share, and hopefully the class wasn't too foolish